This recording is on Chapter 6.2, Graphing Polynomial Functions. When you're graphing polynomial functions, there are two considerations. The first consideration, which we'll deal more thoroughly with in Chapter 6.7, is where does the graph turn? The graph of the polynomial function has at most the degree, so that's your biggest exponent, minus 1 turning points. The second consideration is what is the end behavior of the graph, meaning what happens to f of x, meaning what happens to y, the y values, as x gets very large or very small. The end behavior depends upon the degree, so whether it's even or odd, and the leading coefficient, whether it's positive or negative. So when you have an even degreed polynomial, it's going to be some type of parabola. It will either open up or open down. If it's positive, if the leading coefficient is positive, it'll open up. If the leading coefficient is negative, it will open down. For odd degreed polynomials, 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., they are kind of like a line, and we'll talk about that linear in just a moment. But if it is an odd polynomial, it is going to rise. If it is an odd degreed polynomial, it'll rise from left to right, just like a positively sloping line will do. And if it is an odd degreed polynomial that's going to be negative sloping, it will fall from left to right, which you can see in terms of the leading coefficient. So the odd ones either rise from left to right or fall from left to right, depending on whether their leading coefficient is positive or negative. If it's positive and odd, it rises from left to right. If it's negative and odd, it falls from left to right. Now how you understand this is back to linear, because linear equations are to the first power. So f of x equals x plus 1. So y equals mx plus b is your form here. And that would make m1, and it's mx plus b, the x is to the first power. So you would have this positively rising line. If it were f of x equals negative x plus 1, it would be a negatively sloping line, where m is going to be your slope, and it'll also be your leading coefficient, and m will be to the first power. Okay, so that's one way to look at it, but we also have another quick reference for graphs. But before I get into that, I want to make sure that you understand the symbol for infinity, which is like a sideways 8. And infinity is some kind of abstract concept describing something without limit. The thing I share with my students is, for me, infinity is when I was a young child, I used to take a flashlight out when it was dark, shine it up into the sky, and it would just keep going on and on. And for me, that's my picture of what infinity represents. So see if you can come up with your own, because again, infinity is an abstract concept. It's something that's either that's very, very large and has no limit. So it's helpful for you to have some kind of visual picture of that. Now, these next graphs are going to be basically what you saw above, but I'm going to put them in a little different format. They may be more helpful for you like this. So I do want you to remember before we get started that f of x is the function form, and all f of x is the same thing as your y values. So f of x is your output values or your y values. So we're going to start with the graph that's the parabola, which means it's got an even degree. It's opening up, so its leading coefficient is therefore positive. Now here's the new part to this. You have to be able to describe the end behavior. This is how the book describes it, and I'm going to describe it slightly different. F of x, end behavior is f of x approaches positive infinity as x approaches positive or negative infinity. I look at it a little bit differently, and I'm going to talk to you about it in terms of the picture. As x approaches negative infinity, so these are your x values here on the negative side, as they get really large and move towards infinity, then your y values, your f of x values, will also get very large, but they'll move towards positive infinity. As your x values get very large on the positive side, your y or f of x values get very large on get very large as well on the way to infinity. So I prefer to describe it as x approaches either negative infinity or positive infinity. F of x, or the y values, approach positive infinity. On the next graph, you can see that it is still a parabola, so that means it's an even degreed polynomial. Because it's opening down, you know the leading coefficient is negative, and these are described as follows. Now here they describe it as f of x, so your y values are approaching negative infinities when both your x's are approaching negative infinity and your x's are approaching positive infinity. My preference is to describe it like this. As x approaches negative or positive infinity, f of x, the y values, approach negative infinity. Okay, the next picture is a positively sloping odd. It's got to be odd because it's not a parabola, so it's an odd polynomial. It rises from left to right. Of course, this wouldn't be to the first power because it has at least one term in it. So your degree is odd. Your leading coefficient is positive because it's rising from left to right. And again, this is how the book describes the end behavior. F of x approaches negative infinity as x approaches negative infinity. So as you go towards the negative infinity, your f of x's or your y values are going towards negative infinity. And then also f of x approaches positive infinity, so f of x is going on into positive infinity as x is approaching positive infinity. My preference is to state it as x approaches negative infinity, f of x or y approach negative infinity. And as x approaches positive infinity, f of x or y approaches positive infinity as well. Use the one that makes more sense to you. In the last one, this is also going to be an odd degreed polynomial because it's falling from left to right. It's not a line because it's got a turn in it, but it's mimicking that direction of a negatively sloping line. The leading coefficient again is negative, and it's an odd degreed polynomial. The book describes the end behavior as f of x approaching positive infinity as x is going out towards negative infinity. Likewise, f of x approaches negative infinity as x is approaching positive infinity. Now my preference is to state it as x approaches negative infinity, the f of x or y approaches positive infinity, and then as x approaches positive infinity, the f of x or y values will approach negative infinity. Again, use what works best for you in terms of the end behavior description. I'll accept either one. The blue is the book description, more formal mathematically, but the red may be a little more clear for you. Now there's going to be a second recording on this. This is just pretty much the idea behind what you're doing. The second recording will actually include how to create a coordinate graph, plot it, and then look at the end behavior of a polynomial graph.